It is September 23rd, 2024, and Zelensky has arrived in the US for his highly anticipated visit this week, in which he is supposed to present his so called victory plan for how he thinks he's going to defeat Russia. Now, I am guessing that that plan, which seems to read much more like a NATO wish list, may have a lot in common with Zelensky's so called 10-point peace plan, which literally calls for Russia's unconditional surrender, in the sense that his victory plan has as much to do with Kiev's victory as his peace plan has to do with ensuring actual peace in the region. And before we get into that, just a quick reminder that I do have a brand new series that I'm starting over on my Patreon, or also for paid subscribers on my Substack page if you prefer that instead. It's called Sanctioned, and every week I'm going to be diving into a new topic, a bit more of a deep dive on a specific topic or date in history than I typically do on my regular channel. The first episode actually looks back at 1 year ago when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stood before the United Nations General Assembly, gave a speech that not a lot of people listened to in the room there, but gave a speech that was nevertheless heard around the world, in which he held up a map that had the title The New Middle East, and he proclaimed that this was the new Middle East. The only problem was that Palestine was completely erased from that map. It's very telling to have a speech like that put out there to the world over 2 weeks before the October 7th attacks were carried out by Hamas and other groups within the Palestinian resistance against Israel. So in the first episode of Sanctioned, I get into the significance of that speech, the context surrounding it, and what it really tells us, especially 1 year later, given the current situation that we are in with escalating tensions in the Middle East, all fueled by Israel and enabled by the US. So be sure to check that out. Again, that's available for my paid subscribers on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. Also available for my paid subscribers on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. All right, let's get into the latest coming out of Zelensky's visit to the US, what we're expecting this week, and also what the conflict with Ukraine is currently looking at as we take a look at the latest coming from the battlefield. We discussed all that and more with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Rachel, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Always good to have you. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here. I know that Zelensky has officially landed in the US for his highly anticipated visit this week, which CNN described as Zelensky planning to present his victory plan to defeat Russia. What do we know about this plan, and what do you make of the timing of it, especially after Russian President Putin has made it clear that if Washington does lift the restrictions on long-range missiles, which is apparently in this plan, Moscow will see it as a direct attack, not from Kiev, but from the US?
Rachel, have you ever seen the South Park episode, the very memed South Park episode that involves gnomes collecting underpants?
I have not seen that one.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm sure you'll find it out there very easily. They create a little presentation. So phase 1 of their plan is the gnomes collect underpants. Phase 2 of their plan, question mark, undefined as of yet. Phase 3 of their plan, profit, right? This is Zelensky's victory plan. Go to the US and beg them for help. Phase 2, question mark. Phase 3, Kiev regime victory. Right? I mean, that's the extent of this. All right. So we've had some leaks of what his victory plan may contain. The Kremlin doesn't seem too worried about it. They're like, literally, I believe one of the quotes from one of the Russian spokesmen was, "How are we supposed to know what that madman thinks?" So supposedly he's going to demand to immediately be admitted to NATO and the EU. He's going to demand that NATO conduct long-range missile strikes in Ukraine which he's been demanding for months now, to no avail thus far. He's going to demand unlimited flow of weapons, despite the Pentagon at the end of last week saying, tap, tap, we're out. The CNN reported that the Pentagon has said that future aid packages to the Kiev regime in Ukraine will have to get smaller and less frequent and will be drawn solely from production, because their own U.S. military stockpiles of the type of equipment such as artillery shells and air defense interceptor missiles that the Kiev regime needs, they're out. They can't afford any more without severely affecting the U.S. military's own potential in a potential conflict situation. Contingency. So everything that the Kiev regime is now getting will be just the rather low monthly production rates, which are not very high because the U.S. has not been able to ramp up, by their own admissions, their military industrial complex and the types of key munitions needed for this artillery heavy land centric war of attrition in Eurasia that they were somehow not prepared for. Other than that, there are demands that the countries of the world, such as China and India, that have refused Western demands to stop trading with Russia, should stop trading with Russia, which the West has not been able to push them to do in the last almost 3 years of the conflict. So you can see, and I believe the last item is he needs a little pink pony with a ribbon, because that was in his peace plan too. Evidently, this I think the absurdity of this hopefully illustrates the absurdity of his demands, such as we understand them thus far. But we'll have to wait until he presents them to Joe Biden or Jill Biden or Joe Biden's handlers, whoever is actually running the country, and as well as Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And I would really love to be a fly on the wall for that conversation.
Oh yeah, I feel like it's literally a South Park episode that we're watching at this point, where Zelensky's like, hey, let me just come over here with my victory plan, as if it's some secret and there's some, magical setup that the Biden administration is going to look at this plan and go, oh, that's how we defeat Russia. And I guess if they were going to put that out there in early 2022, then it may have gotten some traction. But it's like, we're at this point in 2024 where, as you were noting, it's not like the U.S. military industrial complex is keeping up with demand literally just for Kiev, not even to mention Israel waging a full-on genocidal war against the Palestinians and then increasing tensions even more by bombing all across Lebanon today. But yet the U.S. still keeps getting more and more involved. And now you've got all of these mainstream media outlets saying that Zelensky is trying to, quote unquote, Trump-proof aid for Kiev. But does any of that actually matter if the U.S. is getting more involved in this conflict, escalating tensions with Russia, which means that there's going to be more and more destruction in Ukraine as you continue to get more war?
Yeah, I don't really, honestly, don't know how you Trump-proof anything. I don't know if you could Trump-proof Fort Knox, to be perfectly honest. I think Trump would find a creative way to gain access or to kill off anything that he wants to. So how they intend to make long-term commitments that excise the executive office of the United States primary directed powers of foreign and military policy, I don't know. Maybe they'll change the Constitution. I mean, maybe that's a possibility. I actually don't think that's going to fly. So I don't think that they can Trump-proof anything. And the idea that they're talking Trump-proofing something as he goes and presents his victory plan to Donald Trump, maybe that's not the right way to try to spin this. So just suggesting. And his attacks on JD Vance, Zelensky, in his own words, calling him a dangerous radical and extremist over the weekend. I don't think that's actually going to help his case much either. If Donald Trump and his running mate JD Vance do win the election in November. Just saying, maybe you ought to hedge your bets a little bit more.
Be a little bit nicer.
Yeah. Boris Johnson, on a related note, did present his own victory plan. The former prime minister of the United Kingdom, who is known for being probably maybe the biggest Kiev regime war hawk and cheerleader in the West. And he said Russia is done. It's over. All that they need to do is provide the Kiev regime in Ukraine with another $500 billion or maybe $1 trillion. It might take $1 trillion, Boris Johnson said, and then phase 3 victory. Right. So he's got his own magic underpants or magic money formulation. How all that money is going to help when the Pentagon military industrial complex can't print artillery shells or air defense interceptor missiles, I don't know. But, maybe if they just throw enough money at Russian troops, that will shred them with paper cuts.
Yeah, that's the crazy part to me is it's like, okay, you send Zelensky to the US, you make this huge deal about he's presenting a victory plan, you act as if everything's going to work, we just have to make sure that Donald Trump and JD Vance don't come in and ruin it all, which I guess that's setting it up for if Trump wins, then they can just blame him for everything and be like, we were on our way to victory, if only not for Trump and his interference. That's if he does interfere. But when you talk about what's actually going on the ground in Ukraine, I mean, you have Russian forces advancing towards the Ukrainian stronghold of Pokrovsk in the Donbass. We've been talking about this for weeks now. And speaking of living in a fantasy land, or maybe he's spot on and I'm just not seeing it, you can tell me, but Zelensky is claiming that Kiev has reduced the potential of Russian troops to launch attacks in the Donetsk region on the Eastern Front. What does he mean by that? And what is the latest that's actually happening on the battlefield, not in Zelensky's fantasy world?
Yeah, I believe this was actually a statement out of Syrskyi, the Kiev regime's top general. And I mean, technically, if they manage to kill one Russian soldier, then technically they've diminished Russia's assault power. This is what this statement is meaningless, right? It doesn't provide any metric, any standard. We've decreased it by this amount, nothing like that. Like, if one Russian soldier falls and breaks his leg, well, then that's decreased Russian assault potential, technically. The statement means absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, even the Western mainstream media is increasingly sounding the alarm about Russians' advances, taking Pokrovsk now into pinchers. Russian artillery has begun to pound the Kiev regime logistics and transport hub, which, of course, because the whole city is already under artillery fire and operational control, has now ceased to operate as a transport and logistics center, which is now increasing vastly the supply problems for the entire rest of the Kiev regime's remaining forces in the Donbass region. There's street-to-street fighting in the other supply town very close, Sleboda, and Kharkov. Russian forces are already in the outskirts of Kharkov as well. So this is all advancing extremely quickly at this point. And as a sign of how these supply lines are already being severed, Russian forces just to the south of this, the Kiev regime's southernmost bastion in the Donbass region, Ugledar, has been all but completely surrounded at this point. All major roads have been cut off. And at this point, it's actually too late for the Kiev regime forces to withdraw safely. There may be some attempts to flee through fields and whatnot in the middle of the night with high losses. But the Kiev regime's, fortress city on a hill that has been almost mythologized in Kiev regime propaganda now, without, with a little bit of good reason. They did withstand 4 or 5 Russian attempts over the last 2.5 years to storm the city, but it turns out they just strangled it and they cut off its supply lines and surrounded it, and now they have a choice: withdrawal or die as soon as their ammunition runs out, which probably won't be that long. So this is going to be a major blow after blow after blow, and this comes as Russia over the weekend announced also significant progress in Toretsk, in central Donbass, in Chasiv Yar, a fight that has been going on for several months now, in the Kupiansk sector, in southern Kharkov region, northern Donbass, just north of that. So pretty much all along the contact line. And there is reports that Russia has conducted major air, drone, and artillery strikes north of the now recovered Robotyne, where the Kiev regime launched their failed NATO proxy 2023 offensive. Russia has recovered all the territory there, and now they are perhaps looking at launching their own offensive in that direction, up into the Zaporozhye region towards the town of Orehov, from where the Kiev regime's offensive was launched. And this is because they have stripped all of their troops from Zaporozhye now to try to plug gaps in Pokrovsk, where they are unable, seemingly, to even slow down the Russian steamroller in that area.
Yeah, it's crazy to see. And I know that when it comes to really any statement that you hear from Kiev's officials, right, saying, oh, we've got the potential to slow down Russian troops, that's what gets amplified in the Western media versus what's actually happening on the ground, right? Where
Baghdad Bob.
Exactly, where they're like, don't look over here, pay no attention, which then sets it up for when Russian forces eventually take Pokrovsk, that the Western media is going to act shocked, right? They just can't understand how this could have happened. Meanwhile, we've been over here talking about this for weeks now, and it is not coming as a surprise, the advances that the Russian forces are making. Now, another area which has attempted to be a massive blow by Kiev towards Russia, but hasn't really worked out like that. Well, we have Kiev's incursion into Russia's Kursk region, which has been ongoing for 7 weeks now. You do have the Russian Foreign Ministry, which confirmed that at least 56 civilians have been killed and 266 wounded by Kiev's forces. So what is the latest from the Kursk region and how Russia is tackling this incursion?
Okay, so Russian forces, at the moment, their counteroffensive in the region has taken back somewhere around 20 to 25% of the incursion at this point. It continues to shrink by the day. It appears that the Kiev regime forces within the established incursion zone have essentially stopped trying to expand at this point because they obviously weren't getting anywhere. And they're suffering a severe shortage of equipment, even for evacuation or supplies, because their supply lines, of course, are strung out into Russian territory and being continually bombed by Russia's artillery advantage, air superiority, drone advantage, and so forth. The Kiev regime did, over the last 10 days, make an attempt to launch a second incursion in the Kursk area to the west of the breakthrough that they have in the Sudzha direction. This was in the Glushovsky district. They were kind of laying the grounds for that this entire time since the first incursion, but it never really kicked off. Well, they kicked it off about 10 days ago, and it has gotten nowhere. They have been stopped dead on the essentially on the Russian border. They haven't been able to take any of the settlements that were their, phase 1 goals, and it has really effectively turned into that fight. Comparisons to Robotina, where the Kiev regime just lost tons of Western equipment in failed assault after assault, trying to do the same thing again and again and never getting any different results.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me too, especially comparing it to the fact that you have Zelensky in Washington basically saying, hey, just give me enough weapons, just give me an endless supply of weapons and ammunition. If I were Washington, I'd be saying, you're wasting all this, right? You're carrying out these targeted attacks, hitting Russian civilians. You're specifically wasting our equipment. So why should we give you more? Of course, unfortunately, Washington doesn't care about that. But when it comes to the fact that Zelensky is on this trip to the US in the first place, the fact that there's all this talk about a victory plan, is that all just about trying to distract from what's actually happening on the ground, and the fact that this Kursk incursion, which I guess was supposed to be this great victory for Kiev, maybe it's included in his plan, that hasn't worked out well, that Russian forces are advancing, and it's like the bring in Zelensky, we're getting too close to the US presidential election, we need to make it look like we're accomplishing something in Ukraine somehow.
I think that's definitely part of it, right? The continual information war efforts by the Kiev regime to maintain flagging Ukrainian morale for the regime. I mean, particularly when it seems that a majority of the Kiev regime's remaining military forces are forced conscripts at this part, and they've got a problem that somewhere between 80 and 200,000 men have deserted the Ukrainian military, according to their own accounts. You can kind of understand why, whatever kind of curtain they can pull over their own people's eyes to maintain that flagging morale is kind of essential for regime maintenance at this point. But I think probably at least as much or a bigger part of it is, it's an attempt to draw NATO directly to fight the conflict for them, right? Because that's the desperation. That really is the only hope that they have left at this point. That's why, the demands for immediate NATO entry. If they're granted NATO entry or anything equivalent, then they cry, Article 5, come and save us, tag, and theoretically, suddenly all, the whole US and NATO military, which doesn't even have enough shells or air interceptors for its proxies in Ukraine, are going to suddenly have enough themselves to wage war on Russia in Ukraine. Again, I think it's largely fantasy at this point. There may come a point somewhere down the line, once the political climate in the United States and France and Germany has settled, and Russian advances, beyond the Donbass, begin to threaten Kiev itself. Maybe they'll revisit the idea of direct NATO intervention, but I don't think it's on the cards this week.
Yeah, certainly a lot at stake here, which feels like an understatement at this point, but I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. International relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda, thanks so much for your time and insight.
Thanks for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. And if you want to support my work, you can also check out my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid subscriber, join the community there, and you also get access to some new exclusive content that I am working on now. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.